The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Dodge City, Kansas, as the year 1886 brought another scorching summer day to the frontier town. The sound of hammering echoed from the blacksmith's shop, mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of wagon wheels. But today, an unusual tension hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire. Lonely Rancher, a name earned through years of solitude on the outskirts of town, guided his weathered horse down Front Street, his keen eyes taking in the unusual crowd gathered near the sheriff's office. At 43, his face bore the lines of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. His real name was Samuel Hayes, but few remembered it anymore. The townspeople knew him as a man who kept to himself, tending his small ranch with the dedication of someone trying to outrun his past. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." As he approached the commotion, the crowd parted slightly, revealing a sight that made his jaw tighten. A boy, no more than 16, sat chained to a post outside the jail. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face swollen from what appeared to be a severe beating. The iron shackles around his wrists were too large for his thin arms, causing them to slide down and chafe against his skin. "String him up now, I say," shouted Jeremiah Colt, the town's most prominent cattle baron. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his way. "Caught red-handed stealing from the church collection box, he was. In broad daylight, no less." Sheriff Tom Bradley, a portly man with a graying mustache, held up his hands to calm the crowd. "Now hold on, folks. The boy will get a fair trial. Judge Morrison will be here next week." "Fair trial?" scoffed Martha Henley, the mayor's wife, her feathered hat bobbing indignantly. "What more evidence do we need? Pastor Williams himself caught the little thief with his hands in the Lord's money." Lonely Rancher dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden boardwalk. He'd learned long ago to observe before acting, to listen before speaking. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The boy's eyes held a terror that went beyond the fear of punishment. It was the look of someone who knew a terrible injustice was unfolding. "What's the boy's name?" Lonely Rancher asked quietly, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. Sheriff Bradley looked surprised to hear from the usually silent rancher. "Says his name is Timothy Walsh. Claims he's from back east traveling through. Won't say much else." Lonely Rancher studied the boy's face. Despite the bruising and swelling, he could see intelligence in those frightened eyes. The boy's hands, though dirty, didn't have the calluses of a lifetime thief. His speech, when he'd heard him protest his innocence earlier, carried the accent of education, not the streets. "Where exactly was he caught?" Lonely Rancher inquired. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his black coat immaculate despite the heat. At 55, Reverend Ezekiel Williams commanded respect in Dodge City. His sermons were legendary for their fire and brimstone, and his word was rarely questioned. "I found him in the church vestry, Mr. Hayes. The collection box was open and money was scattered on the floor. The evidence speaks for itself. Did anyone see him actually taking the money?" Lonely Rancher pressed. The pastor's eyes flashed with irritation. "Are you questioning my word, sir? I am a man of God. My testimony should be sufficient for any God-fearing citizen." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Lonely Rancher noticed something else. A quick exchange of glances between Pastor Williams and Jeremiah Colt. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but in his years of reading men and situations, He'd learned to catch such moments. "I'm not questioning anyone's word, Pastor," Lonely Rancher replied evenly. "I'm just trying to understand what happened." Young Timothy Walsh looked up at him with desperate hope. "Please, sir," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't steal anything. I was just looking for help." "Help?" Lonely Rancher knelt down to the boy's level, ignoring the disapproving murmurs from the crowd. "What kind of help?" I can't say. Not here. Not in front of everyone." The boy's eyes darted nervously toward Pastor Williams and Jeremiah Colt. "Enough of this nonsense," Colt bellowed. "The boy's obviously lying to save his skin. We've got better things to do than listen to a thief's excuses." But Lonely Rancher had seen something in the boy's eyes when he looked at the pastor and Colt. Not just fear, but recognition. This wasn't a random theft. There was a connection here, a story that went deeper than a simple case of petty larceny. "Sheriff," Lonely Rancher said, standing slowly, "I'd like to post the boy's bail." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Sheriff Bradley scratched his head. "Well, I suppose that's your right, Sam, but the bail's set at $50. That's a lot of money for a drifter." $50 was indeed a substantial sum, nearly 2 months' wages for most men. But Lonely Rancher had been saving his money for years, living simply and spending little. More importantly, his instincts told him this boy was the key to something much larger than a petty theft. "I'll pay it," he said firmly, reaching into his coat for his leather pouch. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Mr. Hayes, I must strongly advise against this course of action. The Bible teaches us that mercy without justice is not mercy at all. It's enabling sin. By helping this thief escape punishment, you're committing a sin against God and this community." "Maybe," Lonely Rancher replied, counting out the coins. "But I've found that sometimes what looks like sin to men looks like righteousness to God." The pastor's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Be very careful, Mr. Hayes. Your soul may depend on the choices you make today." As Sheriff Bradley reluctantly unlocked the boy's shackles, Lonely Rancher helped Timothy to his feet. The boy was weak from his ordeal, barely able to stand without support. "You're making a mistake, Hayes," Jeremiah Colt warned. "This will come back to haunt you." Lonely Rancher met the cattle baron's gaze steadily. "I've been haunted by worse things than helping an innocent boy." As they walked away from the crowd, Timothy Walsh whispered urgently, "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into, mister. These aren't just ordinary men. They're dangerous, and they'll do anything to keep their secrets buried." Lonely Rancher glanced back at the crowd, noting how Pastor Williams and Jeremiah Colt had moved closer together, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Whatever was happening in Dodge City, it was bigger than a simple theft. And somehow, this frightened boy held the key to unraveling a web of deception that reached into the very heart of the town's power structure. "Son," he said quietly, "I think it's time you told me what you were really doing in that church." The ride to Lonely Rancher's modest homestead passed in tense silence. Timothy Walsh sat hunched in the saddle behind him, occasionally wincing from his injuries. The ranch lay 5 miles outside Dodge City, a simple but well-maintained spread with a small cabin, barn, and corral. It was exactly the kind of place a man went when he wanted to disappear from the world. Once inside the cabin, Lonely Rancher poured water from a pitcher into a basin and handed Timothy a clean cloth. "Clean yourself up, son, then we'll talk." The cabin was sparse but comfortable, with handmade furniture and a stone fireplace. Books lined one wall, an unusual sight for a frontier ranch. Timothy noticed titles on law, philosophy, and literature, suggesting his rescuer was far more educated than his rough appearance indicated. After washing the blood from his face and hands, Timothy sat at the simple wooden table, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted a cup of coffee. The warmth seemed to give him courage. "My name really is Timothy Walsh," he began, his voice stronger now. "But I'm not just a drifter. I'm a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. I came to Dodge City following a story about missing children." Lonely Rancher's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Missing children?" Timothy nodded, pulling a small, water-stained notebook from his jacket pocket. "Over the past 2 years, at least 12 children have disappeared from towns across Kansas. All of them were orphans or runaways, kids nobody would miss. The pattern led me here." "What kind of pattern?" "Each disappearance happened in towns where Jeremiah Colt had recently established business interests, and in each case the local pastor vouched for Colt's character when questions were raised." Timothy's voice grew more urgent. "I think they're running some kind of operation using the church as a front." Lonely Rancher poured himself coffee, his mind racing. "What were you doing in the church vestry?" "I'd been watching the church for 3 days. Yesterday evening I saw something that made my blood run cold." Timothy's hands tightened around his cup. "A wagon arrived after dark, covered with canvas. Pastor Williams and 2 men I didn't recognize unloaded what looked like bundles, small bundles. They took them into the church basement. Did you see what was in the bundles?" Timothy shook his head. "That's what I was trying to find out when Pastor Williams caught me. I'd managed to get into the vestry and was looking for a way to the basement when he appeared. The collection box was already open, I never touched it. But he started screaming that I was a thief, and before I could explain, those 2 men from the wagon appeared and beat me unconscious." Lonely Rancher stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the prairie. His own past was filled with regrets, moments when he'd failed to act when action was needed. He'd been a different man then, a deputy marshal in Abilene who'd looked the other way when powerful men committed crimes. The guilt had driven him to this isolated life, but it had also taught him the cost of silence. "You said you're a reporter," he said finally. "Where's your proof? Your credentials?" Timothy reached into his boot and pulled out a folded letter. "This is from my editor at the Tribune. It authorizes my investigation and promises the paper's support." Lonely Rancher examined the letter carefully. It appeared genuine, bearing the newspaper's official seal and signature. "Why didn't you go to the sheriff with this information?" "Because I think Sheriff Bradley is either involved or too intimidated to act. When I first arrived in town, I tried to ask him about missing persons reports. He got nervous and told me to mind my own business. Then, coincidentally, I was arrested the next day." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Lonely Rancher motioned for Timothy to stay seated and answered it cautiously. Sheriff Bradley stood on the porch, his hat in his hands and sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening coolness. "Evening, Sam," the sheriff said nervously. "Mind if I come in?" "What brings you out here, Tom?" Bradley glanced around nervously. "Well, it's about the boy. Pastor Williams is mighty upset about you posting his bail. He's been talking to folks in town saying you might be, well, that you might not have the community's best interests at heart. Is that so?" Lonely Rancher stepped aside to let the sheriff enter. "And what do you think, Tom?" The sheriff's eyes found Timothy sitting at the table, and his face paled slightly. I think maybe you should reconsider harboring this boy. There are folks in town who might not take kindly to it." "Are you threatening me, Sheriff?" No, nothing like that," Bradley said quickly. "I'm just saying, well, Pastor Williams has a lot of influence. And Jeremiah Colt, he's got connections all the way to Topeka. They could make life difficult for you. Timothy stood up slowly. Sheriff, what if I told you I have evidence that children are being trafficked through this town? Would that change your perspective? Bradley's face went white as a sheet. I don't know what you're talking about, boy. You're just trying to distract from your own crimes. But Lonely Rancher had been watching the sheriff's reaction carefully. The man wasn't just nervous. He was terrified. Tom, how long have you been sheriff here? Going on 8 years now. And in those 8 years, how many missing persons reports have you filed? Bradley's hands began to shake. That's not... People come and go on the frontier. It's not unusual. What about children, Tom? How many missing children? The sheriff looked like he might be sick. I need to go. Sam, I'm warning you as a friend. Let this go. Some things are bigger than one man can handle. After Bradley left, Timothy and Lonely Rancher sat in heavy silence. Finally, Timothy spoke. He knows something. Maybe everything. Maybe. But knowing and proving are different things. Lonely Rancher stood and walked to a chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and pulled out a gun belt with a well-maintained Colt 45. If what you're saying is true, we're dealing with people who've killed to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we need to get into that church basement and see what's down there. But first, we need to understand exactly who we're up against. He strapped on the gun belt, the familiar weight bringing back memories of his law enforcement days. Tell me everything you know about Jeremiah Colt's business operations. Timothy opened his notebook and began reading. Colt owns cattle ranches, but that's just the surface. He's also involved in railroad contracts, land speculation, and what he calls labor procurement for mining operations in Colorado. That last one is interesting. He's been advertising for workers, but never seems to have trouble filling positions, even for dangerous jobs that most men won't take. Labor procurement, Lonely Rancher repeated thoughtfully. That's a fancy term for something ugly. There's more. I traced some of his financial records through contacts in Chicago. Large payments to, various churches across Kansas, always listed as charitable donations. But the amounts are too large and too regular to be simple charity. As night fell over the prairie, Lonely Rancher made his decision. Tomorrow night, we're going to that church. But first, we need to prepare. If we're right about what's happening, we're not just fighting for one boy's freedom. We're fighting to save children's lives. Timothy nodded grimly. And if we're caught? Lonely Rancher checked his pistol and holstered it. Then we'd better make sure we're not caught. The next evening brought an unseasonable chill to Dodge City, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Lonely Rancher and Timothy had spent the day carefully observing the church and its surroundings, noting the patterns of activity and identifying potential escape routes. As darkness fell, they made their move. The Dodge City Community Church stood at the end of Front Street, its white-painted walls and simple steeple a symbol of faith and respectability. But tonight, as they crept through the shadows behind the building, it felt more like a fortress hiding terrible secrets. There, Timothy whispered, pointing to a small window near the foundation. That should lead to the basement. Lonely Rancher examined the window carefully. It was just large enough for a man to squeeze through, and the glass was old and loose in its frame. Using his knife, he carefully worked the putty free and removed one of the panes. I'll go first, he said quietly. If something goes wrong, you run. Don't try to help me, just get to the sheriff in the next county and tell him everything. Timothy nodded, though his jaw was set with determination. Be careful. Lonely Rancher dropped through the window into the basement, landing softly on the dirt floor. The space was larger than he'd expected, with stone walls and several support beams. But what he saw in the dim light filtering through the window made his blood run cold. Along one wall were a series of wooden crates, each about the size of a coffin. Some were open, revealing straw padding and restraints inside. The smell of fear and human misery hung in the air like a physical presence. This wasn't just a basement. It was a holding area. Timothy dropped down beside him, and both men stood in horrified silence for a moment. Then they heard voices approaching from above. "Quick!" Lonely Rancher whispered, pulling Timothy behind a stack of crates. "Someone's coming." The basement door opened, and lamplight spilled down the wooden stairs. Pastor Williams descended first, followed by Jeremiah Colt and two other men, rough-looking characters who were clearly hired muscle. "The, shipment needs to be ready by tomorrow night," Colt was saying. "The mine foreman in Colorado is expecting 6 workers, and he's paying premium prices for young, strong backs." "What about the boy who escaped?" one of the hired men asked. "The one that rancher bailed out?" Pastor Williams's voice was cold as winter wind. "Timothy Walsh won't be a problem much longer. I've convinced half the town that Hayes is harboring a dangerous criminal. By tomorrow, they'll be demanding justice." "And if they don't?" Colt asked. "Then we'll arrange for justice ourselves," the pastor replied. "A tragic accident, perhaps. A thief and his accomplice, killed while resisting arrest." Lonely Rancher felt Timothy tense beside him, but he placed a restraining hand on the young man's shoulder. They needed to hear more. "What about the sheriff?" the second hired man asked. "He's getting nervous." Colt laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Bradley's been taking our money for 3 years. He's in too deep to back out now. Besides, he knows what happened to the last lawman who asked too many questions." "Marshall Garrett," Pastor Williams said with satisfaction. "Such a tragic hunting accident, shot in the back while tracking rustlers." Lonely Rancher's blood turned to ice. He'd known Marshall Garrett, a good man who'd been investigating cattle theft in the area. His death had been ruled accidental, but now the truth was clear. "How many children are we talking about?" Colt continued. "Currently, we have 4 in the safe house outside town," Pastor Williams replied. "All orphans from back east, just like we discussed. No one will miss them. The railroad brings us a steady supply of runaways and unwanted children. And the mining operation? Perfectly legal as far as anyone knows. We provide workers, they provide payment. What happens to the workers after they arrive is not our concern. The mines are dangerous places. Accidents happen." Timothy was shaking with rage, but Lonely Rancher held him firmly in place. They had the evidence they needed, but they had to survive to use it. "There's one more thing," Pastor Williams said. "I've been in contact with our associates in Denver. They're interested in expanding the operation. They want to establish similar arrangements in towns across Colorado and Nebraska." "How many children are we talking about?" one of the hired men asked. "Hundreds, potentially. The demand for young workers in the mines is insatiable, and the profit margins are extraordinary. A child costs us nothing to acquire and brings in $50 or more when delivered." Lonely Rancher had heard enough. These men weren't just criminals. They were monsters, trading in human lives with the casual indifference of cattle dealers. But as he prepared to retreat, disaster struck. Timothy, overcome with emotion, accidentally knocked over a small crate. The sound, echoed through the basement like a gunshot. "What was that?" Colt demanded. The lamplight swung in their direction, and suddenly they were exposed. Pastor Williams's face twisted with rage when he saw them. "Well, well," he said coldly. "It seems our problem has solved itself. Kill them both." The two hired men drew their guns, but Lonely Rancher was faster. His Colt .45 appeared in his hand as if by magic, and his first shot dropped one of the gunmen before the man could clear leather. The second man got off a shot that splintered the crate beside Timothy's head, but Lonely Rancher's return fire caught him in the chest. Colt and Pastor Williams scrambled for the stairs, but Lonely Rancher's voice stopped them cold. "Move another step and you're dead men." The cattle baron and the pastor turned slowly, their hands raised. In the lamplight, their faces showed a mixture of fear and calculation. "You can't prove anything," Colt said desperately. "It's your word against ours, and we're respected members of this community." "Maybe," Lonely Rancher replied, "but Timothy here is a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, and I used to be a deputy marshal. I know how to gather evidence and how to present it to a federal judge." Pastor Williams' face contorted with hatred. "You self-righteous fool. Do you have any idea how much money is involved here? How many important people are part of this operation? You're not fighting two men. You're fighting an organization that reaches all the way to Washington." "Then I guess I'd better get started," Lonely Rancher said grimly. But even as he spoke, he could hear sounds from above, multiple footsteps, voices calling out. Someone had heard the gunshots and was coming to investigate. The question was, were they coming to help or to finish what the pastor and Colt had started? Timothy looked at him with desperate hope. "What do we do now?" Lonely Rancher checked his remaining ammunition and listened to the approaching footsteps. "Now we find out who in this town still believes in justice." The footsteps above grew louder and voices echoed through the church. Lonely Rancher kept his gun trained on Pastor Williams and Jeremiah Colt, while Timothy gathered the evidence scattered around the basement. Documents, ledgers, and correspondence that detailed the horrific trafficking operation. "Sam Hayes, you in there?" Sheriff Bradley's voice called from the main floor of the church. "Down here, Tom," Lonely Rancher replied. "And bring some rope. We've got prisoners to secure." When Sheriff Bradley descended the stairs, his face went pale at the scene before him. Two dead gunmen, a basement full of evidence, and the town's most respected citizens held at gunpoint by a man they dismissed as a hermit. "Dear God," Bradley whispered, taking in the crates and restraints. "It's all true, isn't it?" "Every word," Timothy said, holding up a ledger. "Names, dates, payments, it's all documented. They've been trafficking children for years." Pastor Williams tried one last desperate play. "Sheriff, you can't believe these lies. This is clearly a setup. These men murdered two innocent church members and are trying to frame us for their own crimes." But Bradley was examining the evidence, his face growing harder with each page he read. "Innocent church members? These are Jake Morrison and Bill Henley, wanted men with prices on their heads. And this," he held up a letter, "this is correspondence between you and mining operations in Colorado, discussing the procurement and delivery of young workers." Colt's composure finally cracked. "Bradley, you fool, you're part of this operation. If we go down, you go down with us." The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. "Maybe, but I'd rather face a judge than live with this on my conscience any longer." "Tom," Lonely Rancher said quietly, "there are 4 children being held at a safe house outside town. We need to find them." Bradley nodded grimly. "I know where it is. Old Peterson Place, about 3 miles north. Peterson's been on Colt's payroll for months." As they secured the prisoners with rope, Timothy found in the church storage room, more people began arriving. Word of the gunshots had spread through town, and curious citizens gathered outside the church. Among them was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's only physician, and one of the few people who'd always treated Lonely Rancher with respect. "What's happening here?" she demanded as she entered the church. "Doc," Lonely Rancher said, "we're going to need your help. There are children who've been held captive, and they'll likely need medical attention." Dr. Mitchell's eyes blazed with fury as Timothy explained what they'd discovered. "Those poor babies," she whispered. "How could anyone—" "Greed," Timothy said simply, "and the belief that some lives matter less than others." The crowd outside was growing larger and more agitated. Through the church windows, they could see torches being lit and angry voices rising. Martha Henley, the mayor's wife, was, leading the charge. "They've murdered Pastor Williams and Mr. Colt," she was shouting. "They're trying to destroy our community with lies and violence." "We need to get to those children before this crowd turns into a lynch mob," Lonely Rancher said urgently. Sheriff Bradley made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "Doc Mitchell, can you organize some of the women to help with the children? Sam, you and the boy come with me. We're going to end this tonight." As they prepared to leave through the back of the church, Pastor Williams made one final attempt to escape justice. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he called out. "I am a man of God. My word carries weight in this community and beyond. When the territorial governor hears about this, you'll all hang." Lonely Rancher turned back to face him. "Pastor, I've read the Bible cover to cover more times than I can count, and nowhere in it does God give permission to sell children into slavery. You're not a man of God. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing." The ride to the Peterson place was tense, with Dr. Mitchell and 3 other women following in a wagon loaded with medical supplies and blankets. The old farmhouse sat in a depression between 2 hills, isolated and perfect for hiding terrible secrets. They found Peterson sitting on his porch with a shotgun across his knees, clearly expecting trouble. When he saw Sheriff Bradley's badge gleaming in the moonlight, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "It's over, isn't it?" he asked quietly. "Where are the children, Peterson?" Bradley demanded. The old man pointed to the root cellar behind the house. "They're scared and hungry, but they're alive. I never wanted to hurt kids. Colt said they were just going to work in the mines, make some money, have a better life than begging on the streets." Dr. Mitchell was the first to reach the cellar. What she found there would haunt her dreams for years to come. 4 children, ranging in age from 8 to 14, chained in a dark, damp space barely fit for animals. They were dirty, malnourished, and terrified, but alive. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." As they brought the children into the light, Timothy documented everything with his notebook and the small camera he'd hidden in his pack. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 8 years old, looked up at Lonely Rancher with huge, frightened eyes. "Are you going to sell us too, mister?" Lonely Rancher knelt down to her level, his weathered face gentle. "No, sweetheart. Nobody's ever going to sell you again. You're going to go to good families who will love you and take care of you." By the time they returned to town, word of the rescue had spread. The angry crowd that had gathered at the church had transformed into something else entirely. A community grappling with the realization that evil had been hiding in plain sight among them. Mayor Henley, faced with irrefutable evidence and the testimony of the rescued children, had no choice but to support the arrests. The territorial governor, when contacted by telegraph, promised a full investigation and federal prosecutors. 3 months later, Pastor Williams and Jeremiah Colt were convicted of human trafficking, conspiracy, and murder. They were sentenced to life in federal prison. Peterson, who cooperated fully with authorities and testified against his former associates, received a lighter sentence of 10 years. Sheriff Bradley, despite his previous involvement, was allowed to keep his badge after agreeing to work with federal marshals to dismantle the broader trafficking network. His knowledge of the operation proved invaluable in rescuing dozens of other children and arresting conspirators across 3 states. Timothy Walsh's articles for the Chicago Tribune sparked a national conversation about child welfare and led to new federal laws protecting vulnerable children. He eventually wrote a book about the case, donating all proceeds to organizations that helped orphaned and runaway children. The 4 children rescued from the Peterson place were placed with loving families. The youngest girl, whose name was Emma, was adopted by Dr. Mitchell, who had never married, but found her calling as a mother. The others found homes with families in nearby towns, far from the memories of their ordeal. As for Lonely Rancher, he discovered that standing up for others had given his life new meaning. He sold his isolated ranch and moved closer to town, where he opened a small school for children who had nowhere else to go. His past as a deputy marshal, combined with his hard-won wisdom about justice and mercy, made him an ideal teacher for young people who had lost faith in the world. On quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch and watch the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson. The loneliness that had defined his life for so many years had been replaced by something better. The knowledge that sometimes one person's courage to do what's right can change everything. The town of Dodge City had learned a hard lesson about the price of looking the other way when evil hides behind respectability. But they had also learned about the power of redemption, the importance of protecting the vulnerable, and the truth that real strength comes not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. In the end, Timothy Walsh had been right about one thing. The truth had indeed set them all free. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.